I wanted to record some of this on my channel and whatnot because someday, I don't know if it will or not, but someday it may be part of history.
This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, David Muir.
Good afternoon. We are coming on the air as the nation witnesses an historic moment in Washington, D.C., a first in U.S. history. A former president criminally charged with allegedly working to overturn the results of a presidential election that the special counsel alleges Donald Trump knew he lost. There you see Donald Trump, obviously emerging from his plane. It has just landed at Reagan Airport in Washington. He will now head to appear in federal court for the arraignment to answer for the first time to criminal charges stemming from the special counsel's investigation into attempts to overturn the 2020 election. The former president traveling today from Bedminster to Washington. This was not quite the return to Washington this former president had envisioned for himself. This is Donald Trump's third criminal indictment, but these are the most serious charges that he or any other president has ever faced. The former president's motorcade will now take him from Reagan Airport, right there in Washington, of course, through the streets of the Capitol to the E. Barrett Prettyman U.S. Federal Courthouse. It's just blocks from the White House and the Capitol. ABC News has learned that once he is there, he will be fingerprinted, but not photographed or handcuffed. And then he will take the elevator to the E. Barrett Prettyman U.S. Federal Courthouse. It's just blocks from the White House and the Capitol. ABC News has learned that once he is there, he will be fingerprinted or any other president has ever faced. The former president's motorcade will now take him from Reagan Airport, right there in Washington, of course, through the streets of the Capitol to the E. Barrett Prettyman U.S. Federal Courthouse. It's just blocks from the White House and the Capitol. ABC News has learned that once he is there, he will be fingerprinted, but not photographed or handcuffed. And then he will take the elevator to a second-floor courtroom to be arraigned before a judge. As you all know, we have been reporting here. It was just 2 days ago, late Tuesday, Special Counsel Jack Smith filed his indictment of the former president, alleging Trump knew he lost his re-election bid, but was determined to remain in power, and that he allegedly engaged in a months-long conspiracy of lies and actions to change the outcome of the election. Trump faces 4 felony charges he will answer to today. Count 1, conspiracy to defraud the United States. Count 2, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. Also, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding. And then count 4 right there, conspiracy against rights. Now, this involves denying voters' rights to have their votes count, to have the actual results certified there in Washington. Now, the indictment claims that the former president, quote, targeted a bedrock function of the United States federal government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. The indictment also describes 6 unnamed co-conspirators who, we should point out at this point, are not facing charges, but of course that could all change as we move forward here. The indictment alleges that Trump and the co-conspirators created fake electors in, quote, 7 targeted states, compelled, quote, the Justice Department to conduct sham election crime investigations, that he pressured Vice President Pence to, quote, reject legitimate electoral votes and send supporters, quote, to the Capitol to obstruct the certification proceeding and to exert pressure on the vice president. Again, you're looking at live pictures. This is the motorcade taking the former president now from Reagan Airport, where he just touched down a short time ago, to that federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. Today's filing is, of course, the second federal criminal indictment stemming from Jack Smith's months-long investigation. And we always try to remind everyone here that these were grand juries, jurors who looked at the evidence gathered in both of these cases and handed up indictments. In June, Donald Trump pleading not guilty to what is now a 40-count indictment involving his handling of classified documents after leaving the White House. Last week, the special counsel filed what's called a superseding indictment, essentially additional charges, adding 3 more charges against Trump, alleging Trump himself got on the phone, that an aide then secretly traveled to Mar-a-Lago, walked through a tunnel with a flashlight with Mar-a-Lago's property manager to find the surveillance outside the storage room where the classified documents had been placed to erase what was on the server. Also, charges for that aide and the property manager at Mar-a-Lago. Also for the alleged efforts to delete the surveillance, which, by the way, because of employee number 4 in that superseding indictment, when that employee was approached, allegedly saying, I don't believe I have the right to do this. That's why it's believed Jack Smith has surveillance, actually, that was not deleted from Mar-a-Lago. We should mention the trial in that case is set to take place in Florida next spring. That's next May, right in the middle of this race for president. Trump also faces criminal charges in a separate case in New York City, as you know, in March. A Manhattan grand jury indicting him on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Those charges stem, of course, from hush money payments before the pivotal
Hold on a sec.
flashlight with Mar-a-Lago's Mar-a-Lago walked through a tunnel with a flashlight with Mar-a-Lago's property manager to find the surveillance outside the storage room where the classified documents had been placed to erase what was on the server. Also, charges for that aide and the property manager at Mar-a-Lago. Also for the alleged efforts to delete the surveillance, which, by the way, because of employee number 4 in that superseding indictment, when that employee was approached, allegedly saying, "I don't believe I have the right to do this." That's why it's believed Jack Smith has surveillance, actually, that was not deleted from Mar-a-Lago. We should mention the trial in that case is set to take place in Florida next spring. That's next May, right in the middle of this race for president. Trump also faces criminal charges in a separate case in New York City, as you know, in March. A Manhattan grand jury indicting him on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Those charges stem, of course, from hush money payments before the pivotal 2016 presidential election. So let's carefully take you through what we're going to witness here as a country today. We're watching the motorcade now, taking the former president to Washington. And we have been on the air here at ABC covering each one of these indictments. But legal observers watching this case say this is the one that makes history. Not that the others aren't heavy, that the others aren't important, but this one alleges a former president, for the first time in our history, tried to overturn an election that he knew he lost. I want to bring in our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, who is watching along with me right here at the desk in New York with the rest of the team. And Pierre, Jack Smith's motorcade, we also learned just he lost. I want to bring in our...
I just wanted to tell ya, and you already know this to be true yourself. If this was me or you or anyone else, especially Henry Winkler, Henry Winkler, the pause, we would already be in prison, jail, prison, what the fuck ever. Whether we had the money that Trump has or not, I don't know. And the money, that may be the reason why he's still out as a free man, because he has all that fucking money. Well, back to the bullshit of history maybe someday.
Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas, who is watching along with me right here at the desk in New York with the rest of the team. And Pierre, Jack Smith's motorcade, we also learned just moments ago, making its way to the courthouse. It's believed the special counsel will be right there in that courtroom today.
Just like he was in Florida, we anticipate that he will be in the courthouse to witness the proceeding and to, in some cases, look Donald Trump directly in the eye.
Okay, hold on.
First time in our history,
Hold
tried
on.
to overturn an election.
Hold on, just hold the phone.
This one alleges a former president, for the first time in our history, tried to overturn an election that he knew he lost. I want to bring in our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, who is watching along with me right here at the desk in New York with the rest of the team. And Pierre, Jack Smith's motorcade, we also learned just moments ago, making its way to the courthouse. It's believed the special counsel will be right there in that courtroom today.
Just like he was in Florida, we anticipate that he will be in the courthouse to witness the proceeding and to, in some cases, look Donald Trump directly in the eye. David, suffice it to say, this is the most consequential case the Justice Department has ever brought. It was not taken lightly, according to my sources, that the special counsel had to come to the conclusion that Donald Trump was a criminal president, that at the end of his presidency, faced with losing, he got information that he lost. And the special counsel, and as you pointed out on Tuesday, locked in on the notion that Donald Trump was allowed to make false claims. He was allowed to go to court to make the case that he won. But the moment that he used the power of the presidency to try to stop the certification of his rival, Joe Biden, to become president, that this became illegal.
And that is a key point here, Pierre, because what the special counsel, it would seem, is trying to do here is to take away a key part of what Donald Trump's defense will likely be, that he is constitutionally protected, that speech is protected. What Jack Smith essentially is saying in this speaking indictment is that you're right, your speech is protected. You can even make false claims, but the way you fight it is through lawful means, and he said, which is what the former president did and was unsuccessful repeatedly, and in many of those cases, with Trump-appointed judges.
Absolutely. The fact that former President Trump went to court after court and was rebuffed. And the other thing that sources are pointing out, when you read the indictment, the special counsel takes great care to expose the notion that Donald Trump was pursuing the notion of wide-scale fraud in state after state. And then time after time, for example, there's a case in Georgia where 10,000 votes, he said, were put forth by dead people. But in every case, the people in a position to know would tell him, Mr. President, that is incorrect, it's false. So they said he had no reason to suspect that he won.
Let's listen to this for a moment from the control room, if we can bring up the audio on this motorcade in Washington. For those of us who have covered Washington and presidencies, we know the familiar sound of the sirens from presidential motorcades. Though it's quite surreal to hear it play out in this scenario. Aaron Kaczynski is at the federal courthouse in Washington as we watch these live pictures of former President Trump's motorcade take him to that courthouse where he will be arraigned just a short time from now. We have just learned that the former president is alone in the motorcade. This is how it played out in South Florida in the classified documents case, and again today. To imagine what must be playing out in his mind as the former president returns to Washington, and again, this courthouse, not far from the White House, and actually just steps from the Capitol as well. Aaron, take us through what we expect to play out once the former president arrives.
Former President Trump, David, is now approaching a courthouse where Watergate defendants were prosecuted. And as soon as he arrives, he is going to see a scene of protesters, both for him and against him.
Hold on.
Protesters have been...
Hold on.
We have just learned that from presidential motorcades, though it's quite surreal to hear it play out in this scenario. Aaron Kaczynski is at the federal courthouse in Washington as we watch these live pictures of former President Trump's motorcade take him to that courthouse where he will be arraigned just a short time from now. We have just learned that the former president is alone in the motorcade. This is how it played out in South Florida in the classified documents case, and again today. To imagine what must be playing out in his mind as the former president returns to Washington, and again, this courthouse, not far from the White House, and actually just steps from the Capitol as well. Aaron, take us through what we expect to play out once the former president arrives.
Former President Trump, David, is now approaching a courthouse where Watergate defendants were prosecuted. And as soon as he arrives, he is going to see a scene of protesters, both for him and against him. Across the street, protesters have been blaring music and the Pledge of Allegiance with a giant speaker set up across Pennsylvania Avenue. And he is going to be immediately taken to the second floor for processing as a criminal defendant. His fingerprints will be scanned. He'll have to give over some basic information, his social security number, his address. But at no time is he going to be in handcuffs. And there's no need for a mugshot, we're told, because the former president, David, is already one of the most photographed people in the country. So after this quick bout of processing, he's going to be taken into a courtroom that's normally used by the chief judge in this district. He's going to appear before a federal magistrate, enter a plea of not guilty, and he will be seated with two attorneys at the defense table. John Lauro, who was only recently hired by the former president after he received a target letter formally informing him that he is a target of the investigation by the special counsel, and by Todd Blanche, who's been with him for indictments previously. Otherwise, it's the two of them, the former president. There are others in the motorcade, political advisors, legal advisors, but as you say, David, he is riding to this courthouse alone.
Extraordinary to imagine, John Carl. We know this route very well ourselves. You know, he's crossed the Potomac now, past the Jefferson Memorial, on his way back to very familiar territory for him. He'll be just a couple of blocks from the White House, where obviously he served for 4 years, was hoping he would serve longer. Steps from the Capitol, where the scene played out on January 6th, and where the country witnessed the January 6th hearings. But again, some of that evidence that they uncovered, perhaps the foundation of this indictment, but the indictment goes much further. Jack Smith has shed light on things that we did not know. And one of the main questions going into today is just how much more? What did Jack Smith hold back? That is a key question as we watch this play out over the next several months.
Just last night, his former Attorney General, Bill Barr, said that he believes that Jack Smith held back quite a bit. I know that I had big questions going into seeing this indictment. One of the big questions that I had is, what about Mark Meadows? No person spent more time with Donald Trump on January 6th or in the days leading up to it as his chief of staff, Mark Meadows. We've heard very little from Meadows over the past several months. We know that he's talked to the special counsel. We have no idea what he's had to say, what his level of cooperation is. And there's very little in this indictment that sheds any light on that. So there are, it's just one example of questions that we have. One thing that is new in here is the testimony of former Vice President Pence. As you recall, Pence refused to talk to the January 6th committee. He challenged the special counsel's right to interview him in this case, at least in regard to his duties on January 6th. And the special counsel had to fight in court to compel Pence's testimony. So there, we see some very interesting things in this indictment from Mike Pence's testimony, but there's a lot else that we know that he's looked at that we don't see in here.
That we have yet to see from Jack Smith. And again, you point out that Mike Pence, one of the things in the indictment, of course, the contemporaneous notes from Mike Pence that have been handed over to Jack Smith. And we're now staring down at a potential trial where Mike Pence, the former vice president, will be the star witness in the federal criminal case against Donald Trump, alleging that he tried to overturn an election that the special counsel says he knew he lost. As we look at these live pictures, I want to bring in John Santucci, who has covered Donald Trump for us for years as a candidate, then president, now a candidate again. And John, when you hear that the former president is traveling alone in this motorcade, take us into his thought process and what's played out so far today. And the other question for you, John, people at home are really going to want to know, does the former president understand, recognize the weight of what is playing out here today? We know what he's saying publicly, but privately, does he understand the weight of this?
Well, David, I'll go in that order with you. So on the latter question to you, he absolutely understands the weight of this. I think Donald Trump was stunned, stupefied was the word I heard when that target letter arrived just 2 weeks ago to his lawyers late on a Sunday night. This was the case, David, that he was told repeatedly, this is not going to hit you. Don't worry about this one. So the fact that these charges were brought, the fact that Donald Trump is heading to D.C. right now, Donald Trump himself, truly, from what I hear, David, cannot believe it. Now, as far as Donald Trump's day-to-day, rather routine, as one person said to me, we're kind of used to it at this point. Donald Trump waking up this morning in Bedminster, New Jersey, playing a round of golf, getting off the course, doing some campaign calls, because David, as you and I both know, he is a candidate for 2024, and then getting in that motorcade and by himself again, David, which as somebody else noted to me, he enjoys that ride by himself. And I said, well, how does that make sense? Donald Trump likes talking to people. And they said, well, for this, you have to understand it's a little moment of actually reflection for him. He doesn't want to be bothered during these times, which for a guy, as we know, we've all been around Donald Trump, David, for many years now. Donald Trump likes feeding off the people around him. He likes asking people for their opinions. So to think that he's alone right now, yet again, every time we do this, David, we say it's astonishing, but yet again, the word is valid. It is just astonishing.
That is striking. to hear from some who are close to the former president that he actually enjoys traveling alone.
Hold on.
What John Santucci just
Hold
reported.
on,
Their
just for,
opinion. So to think that he's alone right now,
hold on,
bothered
just for a
during
second.
these times, which for a guy
Ah,
for many years now, Donald Trump likes feeding off the people around him. He likes asking people for their opinions. So to think that he's alone right now, yet again, every time we do this, David, we say it's astonishing, but yet again, the word is valid. It is just astonishing.
That is striking to hear from some who are close to the former president that he actually enjoys traveling alone, what John Santucci just reported here, but also that the former president certainly knows the weight of what is playing out today. In fact, John had reported before, along with the rest of our team, that the former president believed charges were coming in the Mar-a-Lago case, but thought somehow that they would skirt charges related to trying to overturn the election related to January 6th, that somehow that would not happen. But once that target letter arrived, it was painfully clear to them that charges were in fact coming. Martha Raddatz, our chief global affairs anchor, I wanted to get your reaction to something else John Santucci just said, that even the team around the former president has become somewhat used to this, immune to the historical weight of what it is we're watching. You were there on January 6th, and I know it's something you and I have talked about for quite some time, that the hope that as we report these moments in history out, and it's our aim to report them as fairly and as steadily as possible, that the country doesn't become immune to what they're seeing, because you certainly witnessed what you saw on January 6th, and you've also traveled the country since, and you're fully aware that there are many voters out there who still believe that the election was stolen.
Absolutely, David. And as I watch that motorcade and think about what you just said, that he will be near the Capitol. He just passed the Jefferson Memorial. He has the Washington Monument in his view. But most of all, the Capitol. The whole country watched that. I was there. I saw the chaos. I saw the violence. But so did Donald Trump. He watched that from the White House, about 187 minutes from the time he gave a speech to when he finally tweeted out for people to go home. He watched all of that. And that is part of this indictment, that the president fueled this. I talked to an official the next day who said, look, I listened to that speech and Donald Trump gave all those people the green light. But you go around the country, I remember in Wyoming last year, and talking to a man, he said, oh, no one was hurt. It was fine. They were just protesting. And I pulled out my phone and said, let me show you some videos from that day. And he actually said, oh, maybe I should take a look at that. But there are others who will say, no matter how many people have been prosecuted, no matter how many people have been put in jail, that it doesn't really have anything to do with Donald Trump. When I was riding up to the Capitol that day and hollered at some people as they were approaching the Capitol, I said, they breached the Capitol. They breached the Capitol, and they'd say, well, we have to do what we have to do, telling me in instances that they were there because Donald Trump sent them there. And there were armed people, according to testimony, that they thought were in the crowd at Donald Trump's speech, and yet that continued, and yet Donald Trump said, give them help, stop this deal.
Martha Raddatz watching this play out with us here today as well. Martha, thank you. The former president is headed to the same courthouse where more than 1,000 others have now faced charges for their role in the January 6th Capitol siege. Today's proceeding will be overseen by a federal magistrate, Judge Maxilla Ibedaya. She'll oversee this case, but look at this. This is the judge who will then, we just had it up on screen, we can show it again, Judge Tanya Chutkan. She's an Obama appointee. She will be the judge who will be overseeing this case once it's in full swing, if you will. She's already tried a number of January 6 cases. She's already handed out very stiff sentences in these cases related to January 6. In one case in December of 2021 saying, quote, it has to be made clear that Trump...
Now, see, Obama, that is someone I believe they were going to try to screw as presidential or whatnot because, well, That's what a lot of people said. A lot of people said, but they want a black man in office, so when the shit hits the fan, they'll have something else to blame on the black man. So yeah, that's what I heard through the grapevine, but that's just, that's just hearsay.
To violently overthrow the government, trying to stop the peaceful transition of power, and assaulting law enforcement officers in that effort is going to be met with absolutely certain punishment. That quote from Judge Chuptan, who will be presiding over this case, not today, but once the case moves on from here. You don't need me to tell you that as we look at these live pictures here today, that all of this is now playing out amid the 2024 presidential election, just as it begins to pick up steam. The former president, by far the leading Republican candidate for his party's nomination, some 37 to 40 points ahead of the closest challenger on the Republican side, Ron DeSantis. He also is being challenged by who I mentioned will be the star witness in this case. If this goes to trial, Mike Pence, his former vice president, who just today is now selling merchandise based off of what was in the indictment. And I believe the control room has an image of this, but T-shirts and hats that say "Too Honest." In that indictment, the president is quoted, the former president Donald Trump, saying to Mike Pence, leading up to the certification, that Mike, you are too honest. Mary Bruce, who was our chief White House correspondent, covering the race for president, we saw that moment with Mike Pence being pressed by voters for his role, not supporting him, but instead questioning him, saying, because of what you did that day, we have Joe Biden. Again, this point that there are still many voters in this country who believe Donald Trump's words leading up to January 6th.
David, in fact, according to a new poll out today from CNN, about 70% of Republican voters, Republican-leaning voters, still believe that this election was fraudulent, that Joe Biden did not legitimately win the presidency. That is the environment in which this case is now playing out. And Mike Pence is in an incredibly difficult situation here. He has long maintained, and did so just in the last 24 hours, that he was fulfilling his constitutional duty by going ahead and certifying the results of this election. And he has ramped up his rhetoric. I wouldn't call them attacks because he's not necessarily going that far, but we have seen harsher comments from him in the last 24 hours against Donald Trump, saying anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. He is, though, arguing that history, that voters, not the court, should hold Donald Trump accountable. And that is an argument you are seeing repeated by other Republican rivals on the campaign. That this election was fraudulent.
Hold on for a sec.
Of Republican voters, Republican-leaning voters, still believe that this election was fraudulent, that Joe Biden did not legitimately win the presidency. That is the environment in which this case is now playing out. And Mike Pence is in an incredibly difficult situation here. He has long maintained, and did so just in the last 24 hours, that he was fulfilling his constitutional duty by going ahead and certifying the results of this election. And he has ramped up his rhetoric. I wouldn't call them attacks because he's not necessarily going that far, but we have seen harsher comments from him in the last 24 hours against Donald Trump, saying anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. He is, though, arguing that history, that voters, not the court, should hold Donald Trump accountable. And that is an argument that you are seeing repeated by other Republican rivals on the campaign trail, David.
Well, this is a very delicate dance for Mike Pence, who continues to say, yes, that this should not be playing out in the courts, that the American people should decide. Yet he's selling merchandise today off of the fact that he was, in the former president's words, quote, too honest. And as we look at live pictures, we'll come back the moment we see the former president. We'll stay with the live pictures. But in addition, I want to show you this question I asked Mike Pence, because this goes to this question that will be debated, but that Jack Smith contends that Donald Trump knew he lost the election. And so I had asked Mike Pence in his first interview about January 6th, I asked the former vice president, did you tell Donald Trump point blank, we have lost here? Here's what he said. Did you ever point blank say to the president, I will not do this, I will not intervene, we lost this election?
I did, David, many times.
So let's bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan, because this will be part of what the defense goes to, what was playing out in Donald Trump's mind as Jack Smith tries to make the case that it wasn't just Mike Pence, it was a multitude of people who were very close to the former president and the former president himself who knew they lost.
Well, and that's the critical piece here. When you're talking about the witnesses in this case, they're going to be Donald Trump's inner circle. Those are the people who are going to be the critical people testifying in this case. It's not going to be a bunch of Democrats coming in and saying, oh, Donald Trump was wrong and we were blaming him from day one. This is going to be people who either worked for Donald Trump, worked with Donald Trump, supported Donald Trump. Those are the key witnesses. And Mike Pence is certainly going to be one of those star witnesses. And I think it's entirely fair to say that he's going to be the star witness, particularly on one of the counts, right? Because remember, there are kind of differences and nuances between the counts here, right? One of them is with regard to the fake elector scheme, right? And Mike Pence will be a little less important with regard to that one. He's more important with the effort to try to stop the election from being certified on January 6th. On that one, Mike Pence becomes a critical witness. And when you're evaluating these two legally, you hear people say, well, free speech, First Amendment, et cetera. That's a much tougher argument to even make when it comes to the fake elector scheme, right? Because there you're talking about a fraud, right? A group of people getting together to try to perpetrate a fraud on the United States by suggesting that people in various states, Republicans, were the actually duly elected electors when they weren't. Documents being sent in, paperwork to the United States. That's a very different case. It'll be a different defense. And so when we talk about all these charges, I do think as a legal matter, it's important to separate them out because there will be different evidence and different defenses.
And different witnesses who play into each one of those counts. And as you point out, for example, the fraudulent electors, the fake electors, Mike Pence will play a lesser role in that argument. But one of the things that we were on the air when the indictment was released just 2 days ago, that John Carl, if my memory serves me correctly, pointed out first, was that this is an example, Dan, of where they have direct evidence involving former President Trump being part of this notion to create fake electors, alternate electors from 7 key states.
Well, and they needed that, right? It can't just be, well, Donald Trump was pleased about what they were doing and he was thrilled about it. There has to be evidence that he was leading it, that he was making calls. And that's what the indictment says, is that he wasn't just a passive recipient of good fortune. He was the one who was leading, according to the indictment, this effort to create these fake electors, they call them alternate electors, these fake electors in these different states. That's, on that one, if they have what Jack Smith says they have, which is Donald Trump making the calls, et cetera, it's almost a harder defense. I mean, look, this is all going to be a tough defense, I think, but that's almost a harder case to defend than the one with regard to January 6th, where Donald Trump will say, I believed it, I thought it, I was just trying to advocate for what I was being told by my lawyers was our legal rights. When it comes to the fake electors, it's tough to figure out, how you can say, I thought it would be okay for us to send in these documents with people who were not the duly elected electors being named as the actual people who should represent the state.
That's really fascinating, Dan. And I want to ask you for a follow-up to what you just talked about, because you hit on another key part of what will likely be Donald Trump's defense, and this is on the language in front of the American people in the weeks leading up to January 6th. And of course, that morning, you suggest, and it's not a leap because his attorneys have also suggested this already, that Donald Trump will say, well, wait a minute, I believe this. I believe that there were fraudulent things going on with this election. And it's really fascinating that in the indictment, Jack Smith says he has every right to say that publicly. Jack Smith says, go ahead. You have the right to say that. You have the right to actually spread lies. But what you have to do is fight what you believe is fraudulent through lawful means and in the court system, which Jack Smith says is exactly what Donald Trump did, and he lost.
It's the conduct, right? Not the words, it's the conduct. And they're going to have to show legally that he knew that what he was doing was corrupt, was wrong. And they believe that they have enough evidence to do that. It's not going to be enough for just a witness, right, to come forward and say, well, I told him that he lost. That's not in and of itself. Donald Trump could say, yeah, but all these other people told me that there was fraud going on in this state and fraud going on in that state. And my lawyers were telling me that I had every right to challenge this on January 6th. That's why it becomes so critical what the evidence is that he knew that he'd lost. He knew, and that's where your interview with Mike Pence is important. People like Mike Pence telling him, no, this thing is over. I'm being told that I have no autonomy here. There's nothing else that I can do here. And that's going to be one of the big fights here. So I think the defense, when they talk about freedom of speech and First Amendment, is more a political defense. I think the legal defense is more, this is what was going on in Donald Trump's head. He was accepting the counsel he was getting from his lawyers. He was accepting other people's accounts of what was happening. And that's why he did what he did.
And the legal defense is what matters here.
Yes,
moving forward.
But his lawyers are citing this First Amendment. I'm just saying it's not. It's a little bit of a frivolous argument to suggest that it's freedom of speech. I mean, this is what Bill Barr, his Attorney General, said last night. He's right, which is any fraud involves words, right? Just because you use words to commit a crime, it doesn't mean it's all protected by the First Amendment. You can still commit crimes with words. I mean, think about conspiracy to commit a murder, right?
You could ask a hitman, go and kill that guy. That's not protected speech. But this question of what he knew and what he believed is an important one. I think that there's one very crystal clear example in this indictment of where Donald Trump was saying something publicly, not only that was false, but that he knew was false. And it's directly relevant here. And that's regarding what Pence was going to do on January 6th. He goes through chapter and verse and details some of these meetings that had been previously reported and talked about, that Pence has spoken about, all the times leading up to January 6th, where Pence had told him point blank, I don't have the power to do what you are asking me to do. You are asking me to single-handedly overturn the presidential election during what is only a ceremonial role in this proceeding. And Pence told him over and over and over again that he couldn't do it. And after one particularly contentious meeting on January 5th, where Pence said, I can't do it.
The day before, saying, I will not halt the search.
Yes, I will not do it. Donald Trump puts out a statement, and Smith cites it here, puts out a statement that we all saw that night, where Donald Trump said, the vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act. And that is not what was going on. And Trump knew it was not what was going on.
And of course,
so you can't say he believed it, because he didn't. He knew that it was false.
And the key person, the other part of that conversation, is Mike Pence.
Statement, and Smith cites it here, puts out a statement that we all saw that night, where Donald Trump said, the vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act. And that is not what was going on. And Trump knew it was not what was going on.
And of course,
so you can't say he believed it, because he didn't. He knew that it was false.
And the key person, the other part of that conversation, is Mike Pence, who also shared that moment with me, fully aware of what he said to his boss on that day, which is what he had been saying, as you just pointed out, John, for weeks, which is, I will not stand in the way of the certification of this election. You're looking at a moment from the indictment there, but again, these are live pictures in Washington, D.C. as we are on the air today. We know that the former president is now inside that federal courthouse. Aaron Katersky is standing by outside the courthouse. Catherine Falders, our senior reporter with our investigative unit, is inside the courthouse. The moment she emerges with color from inside, we will go to her. In the meantime, Aaron, what's the belief right now as to what's playing out?
The former president's motorcade went underground into a parking garage, David, so we did not physically see him enter, but we know he's in the courthouse, and his first stop is to the U.S. Marshals for processing as a criminal defendant, a process that he's familiar with because he's done it twice before in 2 other courthouses, fingerprint scanning, turning over some personal information, and then he'll be brought to a second-floor courtroom for an arraignment. Outside, and the former president may have seen this on his way to court, there are supporters and detractors of the former president gathered, including someone you may be able to hear shouting into a microphone dressed in a Revolutionary War costume. He has been singing and shouting for the last 20 or 30 minutes or so, and there are people waving flags. There's an inflatable Trump balloon. There are impersonators, a man wearing a jail costume that we also saw when the former president was arraigned in Miami federal court.
I don't see none of that.
With each of these, there is a bit of a carnival atmosphere, but I think this one, David, is a bit more subdued, and that may be due to the location. The federal courthouse here is within sight of the United States Capitol, so as the former president's motorcade pulled in, he's very much returning to the scene of the crime.
It's quite a juxtaposition, Aaron, when you talk about the calmness, the relatively, laid-back nature of those who have gathered there today. When you think about that being the very route that some of those on January 6th took to get to the Capitol, which is just steps from where you're standing, Aaron.
Really, David, this area was overrun with protesters, and as you mentioned, more than 1,000 defendants have been charged for their varying roles in the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. And David, while the former president isn't charged directly, he is now facing criminal charges, in part because of January 6th.
Alina Habba, spokesperson with the Trump campaign and for the former president. Let's listen in.
Facts. On March 17th, Hunter accidentally admits that it was his laptop from hell. The next day, DA Alvin Bragg indicts President Trump. June 8th.
Alina Habba making the case that this is politically motivated, bringing up the current president's son, Hunter Biden, and we should point out that we have reported in depth on Hunter Biden and his own legal woes.
Well, shut up so we
and the
can
Biden
hear
administration,
her.
their handling of the president's son. But on this day, given the history playing out in Washington, we remain focused on this federal criminal indictment. In fact, the first time this has ever happened involving a former president. Again, Donald Trump inside that courthouse.
Shut up so we can hear her,
4 counts
bitch.
related to his alleged
motherfucker.
attempt to overturn the 2020 election, to hold on to the White House, even though Jack Smith, the special counsel in this case, believes Donald Trump knew that he had lost the election. Of course, that will be a key part of the prosecution's case, as we've been talking about with Dan here. Also key is the scheme to set up fake electors from 7 key states in this country to try to overturn the results. Jack Smith making a direct connection through phone calls involving the former president. Again, there were questions about whether or not they would somehow find evidence directly linking the former president to that strategy of putting in place fake electors to represent these states and the actual outcome from the states instead of an outcome that would have given Donald Trump those particular states. I'm curious because we hear about co-conspirators, Dan Abrams. They have not been named. Obviously, through what's in the public reporting and reporting from ABC News, we know who some of them are, given the evidence here. They have not yet been charged. We don't know if they will be. How much evidence do you think Jack Smith is still holding close to the vest here?
Well, I think if they were going to charge these conspirators, they probably would have done it. Meaning, that's not always the way it happens, but in a case like this, I would expect that if they were going to charge the other co-conspirators you see up there, ranging from Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Sidney Powell, etc., and if they were going to be charging them, I would have expected. Now, is it possible that they could still get charged? Yes, it is still possible. But any good trial lawyer wants to hold back something, right? As a prosecutor, you have to turn over something called discovery. You're going to have to let the defense know what the arguments are you're going to make. You're going to have to turn over to the defense key pieces of evidence to them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to disclose every single argument that you will make in the context of the case. So I don't know how much he may still have in terms of video, audio, etc. But the defense will know that well before the trial, if any of that exists. So there won't be surprises at the trial. Suddenly, the video shows up and the defense wasn't ready for it. That will have had to have been turned over.
And what do you make of the judge, Tanya Chutkin, in this case? We know that she was appointed by the Obama administration, that she has presided over January 6th related cases, that she's handed down very stiff sentences. We should point out that that is not something that is characteristic of her courtroom only. Every federal judge in this district has presided over a January 6th case, and many have handed down very stiff sentences, including Republican-appointed judges and judges appointed by Donald Trump.
Yeah, look, when you look at her background, right, someone who oversaw a public defender's office, for example, that's not typically who Donald Trump was probably going to want as the judge. But the bigger picture question is, how much power, how much change can the judge make in this case? How much influence can the judge have? The most important thing that this judge is going to have control over is the timing. It is clear that Jack Smith and the special counsel want to move this quickly. It is clear that Donald Trump's lawyer believes that you're talking about a very long process to prepare for trial. That's going to be the first issue that she has to resolve, and the most important one in the short term.
Is how much time you give the defendant to prepare versus what is an appropriate amount of time to keep this thing moving, with voters knowing they have to make a big decision in 2024.
Right. Does it happen before the 2024 election?
And does it?
I initially thought yes, but the number of people I have talked to, including some who practiced in her court, think that it's likely that it won't.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I still think that if she decides she wants to move this quickly, she'll be able to. But what you're going to see is if she starts moving this quickly, you're going to see the Trump team trying and appealing as much as possible any rulings, asking for permission to appeal particular rulings, et cetera, in an effort to further delay the case. It really is. This is one of these things where there is no way to answer the question definitively. You have to let it play out and see how serious is she about moving this really quickly. And that is the ultimate intersection of politics and law.
I want to bring in Sarah Isgur, who was with the Trump Justice Department. And Sarah, I'm curious how much of an impact you believe the judge could have in this case.
Well, after the judge was selected down in Florida, there was a lot of conversation about whether that was too friendly to Donald Trump. And something I pointed out at the time was that, in fact, this can be a problem for a team. You get everything you're asking for, then there's no real issues for appeal. Here, I think Trump's defense team may well see an opportunity with a judge who would otherwise be hostile to them. They're going to throw 99 ridiculous motions at this judge, to the point that you can get into a sense that all of their legal arguments are meritless. But number 100, she rules against them. There's your argument for appeal. As Dan was saying, there's your ability to delay this trial further. So she's going to have to stay on her toes as well.
And Sarah, you're an observer, obviously, of the justice system, having worked in the Trump administration, the Bush administration before that. It's important to point out, as we did just moments ago, that all of the judges in this district have presided over January 6th related cases here.
Absolutely. And, this judge, I think, has overseen 58 such trials, while Donald Trump has not been indicted for the violence related to January 6th, the insurrection at the Capitol, like those defendants have. These judges are all intimately familiar with what happened that day from a legal standpoint as well. So in some sense, that's already baked into Donald Trump's trial, regardless of what the prosecution actually is charged here.
And Asha Rangappa, former associate dean of Yale Law School, a legal professor, will be checking in with her a bit later for her perspective, because the question for so long has been, would it be simply the people who showed up and marched on the Capitol at the request of their former president, who was standing before them and saying, we must, in so many words, take back our country? We reported on it on that day, but John Carl, a lot of people asked, will those who delivered that message be held accountable, or at least prosecuted for those words and actions, the strategy leading up to January 6th? Or would it be simply the people who took action on that day at the Capitol, broke windows, took aim at officers who were gathered there, and we saw make their way through the hallways of the Capitol to Nancy Pelosi's office, for example? And in this case, it's a question not only many Americans have asked, but even some of the officers who came under attack on that day.
Yeah, and let's look at Kevin McCarthy's words. I mean, the now Republican Speaker of the House, who was then the Republican leader in the House, on January 13th, exactly 1 week after the attack, stood up in the well of the House and said Donald Trump bears responsibility for what happened here. It was glaringly obvious that the people were at the Capitol because of Donald Trump. I mean, they were carrying Trump banners and Trump flags. They draped massive Trump flags over the eastern front of the Capitol, right by where they barged through and broke past Capitol police officers to get in the building. They were there. Whether or not you think it was incitement in the legal sense of that word, there's no question that they were there because he asked them to be there. And one of the things Jack Smith does in this indictment is he goes through all the times in the weeks leading up to January 6th where he asked people to come to Washington. The famous tweet on December 19th where he tells people to come and says it will be wild. But there were many other examples of that. So yes, we've had all these others, the foot soldiers, if you will. But now we at last, 2.5 years later, have the person that was that was really calling the shots, if not the shots in terms of the violence on the Hill, certainly calling the shots in terms of the overall effort to overturn the election results.
And we heard it so many times, John, in covering these cases, each one of them. And when you hear those numbers, hundreds and hundreds of cases. You mentioned foot soldiers in lay terms. These were supporters of Donald Trump who time and time again said, we were following the words of our president. We were doing what he had asked us to do. And quite frankly, we supported him. That was their defense. And we have that moment on January 6th. There were many moments leading up to January 6th, but of course there was what he said that morning, and let's listen.
We're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
And I'll be there with you. And of course, John, also in the indictment, even though there were no charges for insurrection per se, but in the indictment, they detail how long the president spent in the White House, in that room off of the Oval, watching all this unfold and not taking action to try to halt it.
Now, it's important to point out, and Trump supporters will say this every time that sound is played, that Trump also in that speech said for people to be peaceful. Now, it was one line where he mentioned being peaceful, and it was many, many other lines where he talked about fighting like hell and we have to take our country back. But he did say peaceful. But what this document does is it talks not only about what Trump did while the attack was underway, which is do nothing to stop it until finally at 4:17 that afternoon, more than 2 hours after the Capitol has been breached, the barricades have been breached, he tells people to go home. But even as he tells people to go home, he says, we love you, you are very special. But what Jack Smith does is he talks about what happens after the violence took place and after the Capitol was cleared of the protesters. What did Donald Trump do? He continued to, in the allegation here, in this indictment, try to exploit the violence and take advantage of the chaos at the Capitol by calling lawmakers to tell them to continue to try to stop the certification of the election. And David, this is important because it's a series of phone calls that are placed by Trump from the White House, from the West Wing, and by Rudy Giuliani, his primary lawyer at this point. And it talks about at 6 p.m. Remember, the Capitol is cleared by now. He tries to reach out to 2 United States senators. And then from 6:59 to 7:18, again, the Capitol has been cleared. They haven't started they haven't started the certification process again yet. But co-conspirator number one, that's Rudy Giuliani, places calls to 5 United States senators and 1 U.S. representative. And it goes through and talks about what was said on those calls. Because Giuliani actually mistakenly left a voicemail message on the wrong senator's phone. And in that message, he's asking them, delay the proceedings. Don't let them certify Biden's victory yet. We're still bringing in evidence. And the White House counsel that evening, Pat Cipollone, gets wind that these calls are going on. I mean, again, this is after the riot. This is after the Capitol has been attacked. And they're still making this call. They're still trying to stop the certification. Cipollone, the White House counsel, the top lawyer in the White House, confronts Donald Trump about this and asks him, please drop the objections. It's over. And according to this indictment, Trump refused.
John Call reporting out a key part of this indictment, which is just one more example of what Jack Smith and his team have uncovered. There are several examples of this in this 45-page, what they call a speaking indictment, written essentially in language that all of us can understand. The voters at home across this country, he came out before the cameras and asked the American people, as he did with the Mar-a-Lago case, to read this indictment. It has purposely been written in terms that all of us can understand, not those of us with a law degree. Thank you, Dan Abrams, though, for being here anyway. You help us along every step of the way. But again, John Carl pointing out an example of what Jack Smith has uncovered. The question is, how much more does he have? And how little is he going to show to make the case and then present through the course of discovery as this moves forward, as Dan rightly points out. There's not going to be a surprise for the defendant, the former president, once the trial begins, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Jack Smith is going to present everything right now before the American people. We do know, as you look at live pictures there at the federal courthouse in Washington, that Jack Smith, the special counsel, is in the courtroom. He is there along with the former president, Donald Trump, and the two lawyers who are going to be seated beside the former president, John Lauro and Todd Blanche. We know the president traveled down with a team of 4, although in the motorcade itself, traveling from Reagan Airport to the courthouse, Donald Trump traveling alone, just as he did in South Florida. That was reported out earlier by our team. John Santucci actually reporting out that that is the way the former president prefers to do this in these moments. And now there have been a number of them, which is another thing to sort of take into account as we witness what's playing out on this day. There you see it on the screen there. Obviously, Jack Smith, the special counsel in this case.
Okay. And enough of that bullshit. Not that bullshit. Enough of this bullshit. The only reason I wanted to put this up and whatnot is because someday, somewhere in a universe or a galaxy far, far away, it may be history. And someday it may be relevant history that really matters. Not saying it will be, but maybe not. I'm not saying it will be, but maybe someday it will be. Maybe. I mean, I'm not against Trump. I'm not for Trump. I'm never going to vote for a president ever again. One vote makes a difference in my ass. Obama snowed a lot of us, people. A lot of us. Yes, I voted for Obama way back when. Yes, we can. Yes, we. Time for change. Yeah. Bullshit.